Welcome everyone. My name is Julia Renaud and I'm the Grant-Making Program Coordinator at Rhode Island Council for the Humanities. And we also have my colleague Rachel Jeffers here, who's the Development and Communications Officer at the Council. So I'm happy she's here with us as well. And we're so happy that you all have joined us to learn more about grant opportunities at the Council, and hopefully this will be an informative session and you'll also get a chance to get any questions answered. So just some quick housekeeping items as we get started. So if questions come up for you during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll also have a Q&A at the end where you can raise your hand, I can call on you, you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly, or if you'd like, you can just chat me privately and I can read your question and answer it if you'd prefer to remain anonymous. If you're not speaking, we ask that you remain muted to minimize distractions. And again, we'd love to know who's here, so feel free to say hi and ask your questions in the chat. So my presentation today is intended to give you a broad overview of the Council, to tell you a bit more about the grants program and hopefully to help guide you towards one of our many opportunities. So I can't cover everything in fine detail today, or we would take more than an hour. So I'm hoping to keep things quick and concise, but again, you can ask questions or you're welcome to contact me afterwards. There's also a lot of information on our website, rihumanities.org, if you haven't visited it yet. Speaking of the website, a recording of this session is going to be posted on the website. So if you'd like to share it with your colleagues or reference it later, it'll be there for your reference. We're also going to be posting a shorter video, really just covering our evaluations process on the website soon. So keep an eye out for that. And we're going to send you a follow-up email after this session with all of the materials that I'll be mentioning, like the grant guidelines and our evaluation toolkit. So don't worry about that. You are going to get a follow-up email with resources. So let's get started by reviewing the goals for today's session. So by the time we finish today, you should be well acquainted with the Council, our mission and our funding priorities. Hopefully you'll understand our grant opportunities, our guidelines, and our processes. You'll understand how your proposal will be reviewed by the Council. You'll understand our expectations for evaluation plans. If maybe you are familiar with our process from a few years ago, we've had a few changes since then, so you'll be oriented to that. And you'll leave with tips for preparing competitive proposals, particularly in the age of COVID-19, as we are all existing in. So, the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, who are we? So we were established in 1973. Our original mission was to inspire and support intellectual curiosity in all Rhode Islanders. So generally that's what we still hope to achieve, but 47 years later, our current mission is to seed, support, and strengthen public history, cultural heritage, civic education, and community engagement by and for all Rhode Islanders. So we're the only dedicated source of funding for public humanities in Rhode Island, and we're proud to support museums, libraries, historic sites, schools, preservation and historical societies, community and cultural organizations, individual researchers, and documentary filmmakers in their efforts to bring Rhode Island's stories to life and to amplify the state's many diverse voices. So, I just listed a lot of different kinds of individuals and organizations that the Council works with, and we're going to be getting into that later. But as you can see, we really do work with a multitude of organizations and people on different kinds of projects, including public programs, research projects, and media. We have our grant-making program. We also have partnerships and initiatives. So we're going to be talking about grant-making in this presentation. But if you're not familiar with our partnerships and initiatives, I encourage you to look around our website. We have some exciting projects like Road Tour and Culture is Key, among others. So back to grant making. In 1965, 8 years prior to our founding, the National Endowment for the Humanities was established along with the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEH and the NEA, as you're probably familiar with. And Rhode Island's own Senator Claiborne Pell was the primary leader and advocate for that legislation. So we are the independent state affiliate of the NEH in Rhode Island. And over 40 years later, the NEH still has direct organizational and financial impact on the council. Every year we receive funding from the NEH to help supplement what we raise on our own as an independent, nonprofit 501c3 organization. And a significant amount of that NEH funding goes directly into the community via our grants program. So we are dispersing federal funds allocated to us by the NEH. Overall, the NEH is the single largest funder of the humanities in the US and the largest funder of us, the council. So every year, a very large line item in the NEH's budget is the State Partnership Program, which supports the 56 humanities councils across the US. And there are 56 humanities councils because it's not only the 50 states, there are also councils in Washington, DC, and in all US territories, including Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and Guam. So together, these state humanities councils form a strong, supported network of innovative humanities leaders and professionals united in delivering high-quality humanities programs to individuals and communities nationwide. We benchmark against one another, we share our successes, and we strive to broaden the access to the humanities. And I'm mentioning all this because, some of you may be eligible to apply for funds at one of our sister councils, or maybe you have associates in other states or territories who might benefit from knowing about them. So back here in Rhode Island, the council has awarded over $8 million to more than 1,700 programs and over 650 organizations over the last 47 years. So again, over $8 million dispersed, and every few months we have another grant deadline and we disperse more. So the grants budget for this upcoming fiscal year will be $178,000, and that's the same as our current fiscal year. So just so you know, in this most recent fiscal year, that amount was allocated among 15 major grants and 15 mini grants. And we'll get to those distinctions later, but just so you have that in mind. And as I said, through those grants, we've supported scholars, filmmakers, writers, oral historians, libraries, museums, etc. So, I also wanted to just emphasize again that I'm mentioning this because the council's grant program is derived of funds from both private and federal origin. So you know that the funding from the council does have parameters, restrictions, requirements that are dictated by the fact that they're government funding. So in terms of the grants we make, you might be wondering, what are our funding priorities? So we specifically support public humanities projects, but then people often ask, what are the humanities and what are the public humanities? So there are a lot of different definitions of these flying around. In a nutshell, we can think of the humanities as human thought and action. So in mandating the NEH, Congress defined the humanities as a set of academic disciplines which study the human condition. So we can think about that as literature, history, languages, ethics, philosophy, religion, etc. So that's the NEH's definition of the humanities. How does the council think about it? So one way that we've defined the humanities are as the stories and ideas that help us to understand our lives and our world. They offer us the opportunity to learn from our past, explore the present, and shape the future. They're about culture, community, and connections. And they emphasize the exchange of ideas, critical and imaginative thinking, and the pursuit of wisdom. Okay, so that's one way to think about the humanities. Now, what are the public humanities? So we consider the public humanities to be the vast array of projects that connect quality humanities knowledge and practices with all members of the community. And why do we think this matters? So the council believes that cultural participation through the humanities contributes to greater connection between people, deeper understanding of the past and why it matters, and it enhances the quality of places we live, work, and explore. These factors are essential for civic health, economic development, and a stronger democracy. And again, our mission is to seed, support, and strengthen public history, cultural heritage, civic education, and community engagement by and for all Rhode Islanders. So I know I just went over a lot there. Are there any questions so far? You're welcome to put them in the chat, or you can also raise your hand in the chat function and I can call on you. Good to move on? Okay, awesome. Thanks, everybody. Okay, and if questions come up, just feel free to drop them in the chat. All right, so now we will shift into kind of the meat of the presentation about our grants program itself. So the thinking about, how we're actually doing the what and the why of what we do. So as you can see on the screen, the council offers both major grants and mini grants throughout the year. So major grants are for dollar amount from $2,000 to $12,000. And mini grants are, well, I don't think you'd apply for a grant for $0. They're up to $2,000. So in terms of the types of major grants, so the most popular type of a major grant is a public project. And that's what the majority of nonprofit organizations apply to in order to receive funding for a public humanities project. So some examples of that might be a community dialogue, the development of an exhibit and a panel discussion, an after-school program, or a series of historic tours. And I should mention, if you'd like examples of successful past grant projects, we do have brief descriptions of all of our current and past grant projects that we funded on our website. So you can kind of fill out your sense of those. And it's important to note that for all of our grants, it's important that the projects be both free and open to the public. So, and that's, one of the facets of our funds being a federal origin. So I did want to mention two fairly recent additions to every application. The first one is the civics question. So it's about how does this project impact civic life in Rhode Island? And so that's really meant to inspire you to consider and articulate how your projects are strengthening the civic fabric of Rhode Island. Are you bringing diverse communities together? Are you informing the public of a shared history that demonstrates civic values? Are you sharing stories and experiences that help inform the public's perspective on a current topic that's in the news? If it's for a more traditional civics project, you can talk about branches of government, separation of powers, voting rights, etc. If you're considering a project that's working with students, that would be also encompassed in the public project grants. So that's what the second question up here, working with students, is about. We found in our grant making that there are two key factors for a successful project with students. That if it's in a school, you need to have a letter of support confirming that the program is happening at that school. And we also look for an alignment of work with some educational frameworks. So that's what that question is about there. So those frameworks can range from in-school educational standards like the Rhode Island grade span expectations in social studies and civics, to after-school nonprofit educational standards focused on teaching self-efficacy and empowerment. But the point is that we would like educational frameworks to be guiding programs that are focused on educating students. So in terms of the documentary film, it's kind of subcategory. The council funds the composition of documentary films at various levels, from research to production and post-production. And because documentary films are quite expensive and they often take a number of years to complete, organizations often come to us for a research mini grant very early in the process of the film, and then for a major level request later on. More information about documentary film funding is outlined in our grant guidelines, which, as I said, we will email you following this session, and you can also find on our website. So now for the mini grants, our other standard grant option. There are 3 types of mini grants. So in general, mini grants follow the same kind of structure as major grants categories, with the one exception being the individual researcher grant opportunity. So individual researcher grants are projects that individuals or a small group of people develop to research a local history topic or an idea. And these research projects must culminate in some form of a public presentation that shares the information about what was discovered. So that could be a lecture in a library, or now a Zoom webinar hosted by a library, a website, a research blog, whatever it might be. So through this category, we funded individuals who've researched the history of jazz in Providence in the early 20th century. We've researched people looking at the impact of deindustrialization on housing and neighborhoods and urban centers. Often these projects help us fund labors of love, and they give researchers the extra leg up that they need to disseminate their work to the larger audience. So in terms of timelines for all of these, I'll just go through how that works. So the major grants are on an annual cycle, and the mini grants are on a quarterly cycle. So for major grants, the way that process works is the first step is filing a letter of intent with us. And that portal will open October 1st, and it goes through November 1st, which is when they're due. And then you have the option to, and staff will get back to you as to whether or not your letter of intent has been accepted. Then if you like, you can submit a draft to staff for feedback. We ask for that by December 1st, but then the final application is due January 15th, with decisions coming out about mid-March. So again, that's for the grants that are from $2,000 to $12,000. And the real hard application deadline, the first one is November 1st for the letter of intent. Then it's January 15th for the full application, and then you'd hear about 2 months later. So for the mini grants, we have the 4 quarterly deadlines. So the first deadline is November 1st, the same day as the major grant letter of intent. The next deadline is February 1st. The next deadline is May 1st. And then the fourth and final deadline for the fiscal year is August 1st. And you're welcome to submit a draft of your application to staff ahead of time for feedback, just like in the major grants. And we really encourage you, kind of regardless of what sort of grant you're seeking, to be in touch with us. As I'll get to later on, we are here to help and here to talk to you about our ideas and the council's guidelines and requirements, and to make sure that the way you're thinking about your project aligns with the sorts of things that we fund. So happy to be in touch, whether it's a more formal grant application draft review or just a phone call or a Zoom meeting. And all of that information and all of our grant application process does take place through our website. So, maybe in the past you've applied to us on paper, but now in an effort to save trees and be in the 21st century, everything takes place in an online grants portal. And you can find that off of our GRANTMAKING page. And once you make an account in that portal, you have access to your application. If your grant is accepted, that's where you'll do all your reporting. And so it's just a great place where you can be in touch with us with all of the information. So I'll pause again here. Are there any questions about the information I just shared? Feel free to put them in the chat, or you can also raise your hand in the chat as well. Okay, well, I will continue, and feel free to ask. Oh, can you apply for both? That's a great question. So basically, you can only have one grant open at a time. So in theory, you could submit an application, say in theory, if you didn't have a grant open with us, you could submit a letter of intent for a major grant at the same time that you submitted a application for mini grant. That being said, you wouldn't want them to be for the same project. Because when we're reviewing applications, we want to make sure that, you know, the project really is correctly scoped for the request. So it doesn't really make sense that the same project would be good for a mini grant and a major grant. But imagine you had two completely different projects, both of which were totally appropriate. So say you got the mini grant approved, well, then you would have to withdraw your application for the major grant because you can only have one open at a time. So, you know, it could be possible, but I might recommend just focusing on making the one application as strong as you can. But, you know, and if you have further questions about that, you're welcome to be in touch with me as well. All right. So now that we've discussed the basic parameters of what grant opportunities we have, it's time to look at eligibility. So in other words, who can apply for these opportunities? So in essence, there are three categories of people and organizations who can apply: nonprofits, individual researchers, and schools and libraries. So the list of eligible organizations is fairly self-explanatory, but you know, there are a few things to point out here. So one of them is, you'll see on our application that we ask for an authorizing official and a project director. So who are those people? And I should also note, this is for organizational applications. So the project director is responsible for overseeing the execution of a project, and the authorized official has primary responsibility for record keeping and accounting. So these two roles cannot be filled by the same person. So if it is an organizational application, you'll need a project director and then an authorized official who can kind of legally take the legal and financial responsibility on behalf of the organization for the grant. Another question we get a lot is, can colleges and universities apply for funding from us? The answer is yes, but the project does need to demonstrate a well-articulated commitment to reach an audience outside of the campus community. So that includes strong community collaboration, a well-defined outreach and publicity plan, and stated audience goals. And then another question we get often is, you know, can people out of state apply? And the answer to that is yes, but you should be prepared to articulate the impact your project will have in Rhode Island. So the council prioritizes funding for projects with a clear Rhode Island connection. So there are some additional parameters and requirements to also keep in mind, a number of which do have to do with the fact that these are federal funds. So organizational applicants do need to have a current 501c3 status or an equivalent tax-exempt status. So say you're at a nonprofit that doesn't have a 501c3 or a tax-exempt status, you can partner with a fiscal sponsor who has tax-exempt status. So, you know, we're open to that. And in that case, that entity would be, you know, it would be their staff member as the authorizing official taking the legal and financial responsibility for the grant. You also need to have a DUNS number. So what is that? Those are numbers issued by the federal government to track where federal funding goes to ensure that money isn't distributed to unfundable entities. So all nonprofits can acquire a free DUNS number by registering online. It's a really quick application, but the process does take a little bit of time as it's a government process. So do plan ahead on that. We also have, for organizational applications, we have a one-to-one matching requirement. So if you're an individual researcher, you don't have to worry about this, but if you're an organizational applicant, you do need to, for your request to the council needs to be matched by funds, at least equally, by funds from another source. So for example, if you're requesting $2,000 from the council, you need to, in your budget, also indicate at least $2,000 from other sources. So in most cases, this isn't a problem for organizations because we do consider both in-kind and cash donations towards this. So in kind, say you're having volunteer time that has a certain hourly wage associated with it, but someone's donating their time, that would count. You would need to properly document it, it would count. So in terms of a humanities scholar requirement, we also require that there be a humanities scholar on each project. So we define humanities scholar quite broadly. It could be someone with an advanced degree in a humanities field. It could be a culture bearer, like a community scholar or a tribal elder, or someone who has immense knowledge about a particular subject area or topic that'll be integral to the project's success. We also have an outreach and acknowledgement requirements to make sure that there's a structured publicity plan for each project we fund. Because as I said earlier, every project needs to be free and open to the public, and we want people to know about your wonderful work. We also require that each project recognize our funding by using our logo on print and publicity materials and by mentioning support at public events. And finally, each grant that the council approves also requires final reporting, and in some cases interim reporting. And that's geared towards inspiring reflection on both the positive developments and the challenging aspects of each project. We use information and numbers from these reports for our own reporting to the NEH, and we view these reports as a tool for grantees to document all that they've achieved. So, I have outlined here some additional bullet points for topics that are asked for in our application, and also questions that you can consider when you draft a narrative. So remember, we fund projects, not ideas. So here are some things to think about. Is your timeline feasible? Your project goal, think big. It should be your top level target that you're striving to hit. What are your project outcomes? What are you hoping to change? We love to see civic outcomes, civic-minded outcomes rather. When you're thinking about your project outputs, think about achieving the goals. When you think about collaboration and partners, can you share knowledge and resources? Are there other organizations that are trying to achieve similar goals? Should you partner with them? In terms of audience, really thinking, being thoughtful about your audience. Who is your project really serving? I think a lot of folks think everyone at the outset, but often, narrowing that is helpful. Outreach. What methods will you employ to meet your audience goals? Project execution. Making sure that you actually have the capacity, resources, and staffing to execute your project. So, we can all conceive of very exciting, wide-ranging projects, but does it actually match what your organization can do? Documentation and testimonials. How will you capture the impact of the project on its attendance? And then evaluation, reflection, reporting. What did you learn? What worked well? And what would you do differently? I do want to pause briefly and go back to the one-to-one matching requirements since we have a question about that. Thank you so much. So the question, does it have to be new money? I'm sorry if I'm misunderstanding what you mean by that. I will say that generally, in terms of the idea of kind of new money, our grants, they need to take, all activities for the grant need to take place after the grant is awarded. So by definition then, it would be new money in that, they would be resources that would be used during the grant, the life cycle of the grant, if that makes sense. But I'm not sure that I totally understand what you mean by new money, so feel free to clarify that further in the chat. But I'm not sure if I just answered your question. But the idea is that, say you requested $2,000 from the council, and say it was for can it be a budget line, or does it have to be a new donation to help fund a specific project? It could be, say, you know, it could be a budget line in terms of the overall organizational budget. Yes, it definitely could be. You know, if it's, say it's staff time and it's part of staff salary, you know, that would be fine if it's, you know, staff time used during the time frame of the grant. You know, so say it's like you have someone's salary in your annual organizational budget, but you've allocated, you know, this percentage of it towards this specific project, that would be fine. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so I also wanted to mention, acknowledge the reality we're all living under, which is the age of the pandemic. So, you know, the pandemic has changed almost every facet of our lives as we know them. Public humanities projects are no exception. So I wanted to note also a few of the elements that our reviewers are looking for right now, given that we don't anticipate the pressures of the pandemic being relieved anytime soon, unfortunately. So they're also looking to see, is your project responsive, you know, to our current situation? Is it acknowledging the new limitations and possibilities of our current pandemic reality? And is it realistic, you know? And does it engage with questions and issues critical to our moment? You know, the projects we fund don't have to do that, but, you know, certainly that's a response to civic relevancy, right? So in terms of safety, we want to make sure that you're providing for the safety of all your team members and participants in your project, so that, you know, you're making sure that the execution of your project could be done keeping in mind everyone's health. In terms of digital elements, you know, a lot of people, including the council, clearly are pivoting towards digital platforms for projects and events. So if your project has digital elements, are they current and are they well thought through? And, you know, do you or someone on your team have a firm grasp of and or experience with the technology that's needed to execute your project? And then in terms of creativity and adaptation, you know, how creatively is your project responding to these limitations and possibilities? If your project, if you came up with it last year, but you're applying now, have you adapted your project thoughtfully and realistically to our current reality? So in terms of how your application is reviewed, do want to note that every proposal is carefully considered. As I said earlier, the staff doesn't review proposals. I and other staff at the council are simply facilitators for our reviewers. We give reviewers information on the organizations applying, past funding history with the council, evaluate in terms of all these kind of technical details I'm talking about, like budget line items and DUNS numbers and all of that. But ultimately, the people making the final decisions are members from the council's board of directors or trained community reviewers. So the trained community reviewers particularly relate to the major grant level, in that we receive help from outside experts to better evaluate the projects, including the documentary film projects and the public humanities projects that are in fields where reviewers from our board might not have the most amount of expertise. So proposals are evaluated based on how well you respond to the criteria established in our funding parameters, how kind of thoroughly and thoughtfully you're thinking through your project, the council's grant-making key objectives, how competitive the deadline is, the reach of the project, and, you know, the real scholarly and kind of humanities practice integrity in the application. So I will pause there. Does anyone have any questions about that? You could either raise your hand in the chat, or you can just put a chat in, or sorry, put your question in the chat. Okay. So some staff tips. So our role, as I said, is really to help you put your best application forward. So like I said, we are here to talk to you. So feel free to reach out by email. I have my email address on the final slide, and you can also find it on our website. And we can set up a phone call, we can set up a Zoom meeting, we can just email, whatever is best for you to answer your questions. It helps to show that there's a proven track record for the kind of project that you're undertaking. So either if it's not your first rodeo, show us, you know, that it isn't. And if it is, show us how you're prepared for it. Kind of going to the civic relevancy and contemporary resonance point. So, you know, how is your project relating to what people in your community are thinking and talking about? You know, is there any interest? Partnerships, collaboration, and connection. So again, you know, we really encourage people to partner with individuals and organizations in their community that can really bring another dimension to the project that they're working on. And if you do end up applying, you'll see that there's even a section on our application about partnerships. So, you know, be thoughtful about that. And it's always great to reach out to new partners for projects like the ones the council funds. We also look for attention to detail. So, you know, are you fully answering the questions on the application? And have you really thought through all the elements of your project? Does your budget reflect your narrative? And does your narrative reflect your budget? So we think of the budget as another place to tell the story of your project. And so those two things should match. And again, making sure you really are answering the questions in the application and reading all of the guidelines that are in there. So, one question is, are public art exhibits considered? Great question. So, you know, the humanities and the arts obviously have overlap. There's obviously, yeah, they talk to each other. So we are a humanities council. We do, if there is a strong humanities element to your art exhibition, say that you're thinking of having a panel discussion with scholars who are providing historical context for the exhibition. You know, that would be a humanities component and a part of the project that could be appropriate to seek funding for. You know, so or say you're thinking of developing a booklet to go in conjunction with the exhibition that's really fleshing out a narrative about the exhibition or something like that. So that could be a good match for the project. But generally, you do want to think about, you know, is what you're asking for funding for really related to the art component, or is it a humanities component? I don't know, Rachel, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? Nope, okay. Thank you. All right, so I know I've just given a lot of things you have to do. And so, you know, people might ask, why bother? This seems like a lot of work. And fair enough, you know. You need to weigh the merits of the award with the work to apply for and manage the grant. But, you know, on the upside, why should you do it? Well, the most obvious answer is the financial support and the monetary reward. So it's money, right? It's money to help you do your project. We also find a lot of people see the application as a way to actually push their thinking about their project. It helps them codify their project ideas and their project goals to move beyond the idea phase. Grants also demonstrate community investment. They show that people outside yourself and your specific community are invested in this project happening. It can also help to leverage additional support, resources, and funding. So, you know, once you have a grant in hand, you can present that to other potential funders. There's PR opportunities. You know, the council, Rachel is wonderful with this, with helping to promote grantee events and projects and helping to get the word out. And then it also, you know, people find that it holds you accountable, because once someone else is invested in your project and you have your final reporting deadline, it's someone else cares and someone else is expecting you to do it. So that can also be very helpful. But, you know, I also want to mention that there are many different types of grant funding, and, you know, encourage you all to research everything that's out there. You know, the nonprofit sector is gigantic. So, and there are many funders. So definitely take a look at all of the funding opportunities available. We have a question come in. Is there a maximum annual operating budget an organization can have in order to be eligible for a grant? The answer is no. We have, as part of our application, we ask you for like the range of your annual budget for your organization, but there's no max on that. Yeah. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about evaluation, since that is a fairly significant part of our application. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll be posting a video soon going in depth into this, but I wanted to give you an overview in the meantime. So we also have a toolkit available on our website, and you know, we're going to send you that too. So the inspiration for the toolkit was really kind of systematic issues with people understanding evaluation, and including grantees and including us internally. So a few years ago, the council staff worked with a graduate student, evaluation professionals, grantees, and funding colleagues to develop the toolkit. So the toolkit and the following practice, if these terms mean something to you, I'll say that they're a hybrid of summative and formative evaluation methods. And they're informed by best practices for arts and culture projects, board members, individual insights, and et cetera. But, you know, by no means is our toolkit the be all and end all of evaluation, but we hope it's accessible and that it can be tailored to different sizes of organizations and to individuals. So, you know, there can be a lot of confusion around what evaluation really means. So what we are thinking about when we say it are the plans, strategies, and practices that better allow us to understand the impact of our work. Evaluation plans allow us to make strategic decisions for our work and our organizations. And they help us to better understand what we do, mostly programs, you know, how, in terms of programs, how we do it and ways that we might improve. So an evaluation plan, that's the strategies, the action steps, and the process of implementation that allows us to track and measure our impact. So as we know, the evaluation plan phrase comes up in grant applications. So what are funders looking for? So we're looking for you're using grant money in a way that maintains momentum and demonstrable progress. So it's similar to kind of an athletic training program, if you've ever done one of those. So the idea being you're setting a goal, you're determining the exercises that you need to do to meet that goal, and then you're marking improvements toward that goal. And then you reflect on that. You think about what worked, what didn't, and what might you change. So evaluation projects should help plan your programs, steer them, and improve future editions or similar projects. So, you know, that's really why you'll see in our application, we're looking at an evaluation. We're hoping you've developed an evaluation plan at the outset that's going to not just be an add-on at the end, but really something built through your process that you'll be able to evaluate and, you know, is really going to help shape your process. So in keeping with the notion that evaluation helps to structure programs, it's important to begin the evaluation process kind of at the beginning and follow this flow. So this is an image from our evaluation toolkit, and I'm going to go over it quickly, but again, it's on our website, and there will be a video kind of going into it more in depth. But the kind of first place you start is the project goal. So, and that's a broad statement describing the desired change in the community resulting from your project. So what change overall do you want to achieve? So we also think about outcomes, you know, to be more specific from your goals. So from your goals, what are the concrete and attainable changes in behavior, status, attitude, and skill, knowledge, or circumstance in your community? So kind of what progress do you want to see? And then in terms of outputs, that's the tangible and concrete activities and products of your project. So your outputs are the way that you're going to determine achieve your goals and your outcomes. So then in terms of evaluation, your evaluation goal is going to be the focus area for your evaluation plan. So knowing what and why and what you want to evaluate. And this is going to be informed by your goal, your outcomes, and your outputs. So in terms of figuring out your evaluation goal, or figuring out if you've achieved it, you want to have evaluation questions. So your questions are looking to what do you want to measure or learn, and making sure that those questions are actually answerable. And then your indicators, how will you know the progress that you've made towards answering your questions? So indicators are data that actually demonstrate the change in behavior, skill set, or knowledge described in your outcomes. So I know that, and then there's also the method. So you're want to figure out, once you've figured out your indicators, you want to think about your method for collecting the data that's going to be your indicators. So that can be surveys, observations, focus groups, but I think a lot of times people, when they think of evaluation, they just think of the methods, but it's important to kind of notice here that the methods are really driven by all of these prior steps and ways of thinking about the impact of your project. So I know I like examples. I have a hard time understanding things that are this abstract. So just going to quickly go through some examples. And again, these are from our toolkit. So you can look at them again and think them through. But here's one example of an individual research project. So the project is to do research on local musicians of color in Woonsocket. So the overall goal is to inspire new creative practices and create a historical basis for contemporary musicians of color in Northern Rhode Island. Okay, so that's kind of, as we see, like an overarching, big, ambitious goal. So as an outcome of the project, we want historical narratives of Woonsocket to be expanded and diversified. We want public knowledge of local music and its varied historical traditions increased, and we want new audiences engaged with local Woonsocket history. So how are we going to do that? So the individual researcher is planning to write and publish an article, host a public lecture, invite 3 local musicians to play music composed by the researched musicians, and publish columns in the call about the research process. So as you can see, those outputs are directly determined by the overall goal and the outcomes that this individual is seeking. So what might the evaluation goal look like? Well, the person wants to better understand the impact of what they're doing, of new research and public engagement methodologies on their work so that they can better plan and budget their next project. So their evaluation questions are, what audiences did they reach? Is there any evidence for an increase in knowledge of local musicians of color in Woonsocket? What was important? And how did the project change the perceived narrative of local history? So we can remember that from the outcomes. So the indicators, you'll see here indicators often we're looking for specific numbers because that helps you measure, right? So publishing an article with a run of 500 copies, having a public lecture with 80 attendees, inviting 3 local musicians and distributing 25 free copies of the composition, and publishing 3 columns in the call. So this is helpful because then at the end of your project, you can kind of look back and see, did I do that or not? And then how are you knowing that, right? So evaluation methods. This person's going to make use of online analytics data, a personal research journal, and observation methods. Okay, so there's one example. And then here's another one of a more of an organizational plan. So this is a documentary film. So their overall goal is to increase civic agency of youth in Rhode Island. What are their outcomes that relate to the goal? So public knowledge about local youth organizers is increased, young activists empowered, youth interest in participating in political events and after-school programs is increased. Okay, so how are they going to do that? And sorry, the project is a documentary film featuring local youth organizers in Providence. So how are they going to do that? They're going to, so their outputs are producing a documentary film, hosting public screenings, creating direct action guides, and hosting one public panel. So in terms of evaluation goal, what do they want to get out of it? Well, they want to understand the impact of their film and its effect on people connected to the subject matter so that they can improve their outreach and engagement efforts. So what are their questions? They're wondering, what audience did they reach? Was it as they intended? What particular features of the project make the biggest impact? What's the value of participation? In terms of indicators, again, these are specific, concrete things you look for with numbers. So you want the deadline met, you want 3 local high schools hosting screenings with at least 35 people attending, you want an increase in signups for the youth organizations, and you want participants on a panel and a certain number of 100 people attending. And how are they going to do that? They're going to make use of surveys, interviews, and event observations. And so I hope those examples were helpful. And I know, again, I've thrown a lot of information out there. So I'm going to wrap up my prepared remarks and go into questions. So I know I received a question on chat that I will answer, and then folks can, raise their hand on the chat feature or type questions in the chat. I'm happy to answer them about anything that we've covered here, or anything about the council. So the question I got was, how long do you have to complete the project? It's a good question. So you'll see when and if you apply, you'll see on the application a project timeline. And I'm going to stop sharing so that we can all see each other. You'll see a project timeline. So there will be an end date on there that you will assign to your project. And so we'll follow your lead on that. I think our projects that we fund, they're generally wrapped up, I'd say, in like a year and a half. But, so but it does happen that projects take over a year sometimes. So in that case, the one difference would be that there would be an interim report as well as a final report. But the short answer to the question is that, your project is going to take how long your project takes, and we follow your lead on that. And we have the reporting requirements, and we'd like to be in touch with you, but there's no set amount of time that projects need to take. Rachel, was there anything you wanted to add? Rachel's been at the council for a lot longer than I have, so that's why I'm checking.
I have been, but I don't have as much direct experience with the whole grant making process, because I do a lot of outward facing work with fundraising and communications. So I would just say, Julia mentioned this obviously in kind of the category of why is this worth doing? There are a lot of requirements because it is federal money. I would say that I have seen in my 4 years at the council, I've seen some great examples of how even a mini grant or a small major grant from the council has really been that kind of jumping off point for an organization or an individual researcher or filmmaker to get that community buy-in and spur additional support from other sources. So it's kind of that amplifying effect, not only of our support of your event or your program or your project in terms of communications, but also in terms of being able to go to other funders, whether that's, there have been some examples of organizations going directly to the NEH for even larger funding straight from the NEH, as well as from other community funders and other funders nationally. So, you know, it also kind of gets your foot in the door of this much broader network of other people and organizations that are doing similar work and can be real thought partners for you, and the council can help to make those connections and help spur collaborations. So it can be a really great resource in that way.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Sure.
We got another question through the chat. So, is it okay to apply for a grant for a small portion of a larger project? The answer is yes. You want to be thoughtful about how you're scoping that smaller section, because as I said, everything that the grant funds needs to take place after the award is made. So the council doesn't fund anything retroactively. But say you've been working on a big project and you've decided you want to do specific outreach to a particular population as part of that project, you could apply for grant funding for that specific element, you know, and you know that outreach is going to take place over 6 months, and it's after the grant deadline. Yeah, that could totally be fine. You just want to be clear about exactly what it's funding and making sure that it's, you know, a distinct scope of work that's happening after the grant deadline and the award. Okay, well, I know it is 1:31 and I don't want to keep you all, so I will share my, I will share my email address and encourage you all to reach out to me and be in touch. And feel free to be in touch with any other questions that come up, or if you'd like to talk about your project or your thoughts, I'm here. And I want to thank Rachel for joining me, and I want to thank you all for joining us and for your interest in the council and the opportunities we have here. We're excited to see you and excited to learn more about what you're thinking. So thank you.
Bye, everyone. Have a good afternoon.